The history of the Cold War in 20 minutes. But here's what you won't hear in most documentaries. The Cold War didn't end because one side defeated the other militarily. It ended because of three ordinary people, a factory worker in Poland, a radio host in Hungary, and a dissident in Czechoslovakia, who proved that ideology cannot survive the truth. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how the empire that seemed unshakable collapsed not from nuclear weapons or military invasion, but from a single fatal flaw that no propaganda bureau could ever fix. If you lived through these decades, you remember the fear, you remember the drills, but there's something about how this story is usually told that misses the actual pivot point. And if you want the complete picture, with all the declassified intelligence, the hidden communications, and the mechanisms that actually drove policy, the full guide to this era is available in the description and pinned comment. It goes far deeper than what I can cover here in 20 minutes. Now, most Cold War narratives start in 1945, standing in the ruins of Berlin, asking, why did the Soviet Union and the United States, allies who had just defeated Nazi Germany together, become mortal enemies overnight? The standard answer is ideology, capitalism against communism, democracy against totalitarianism. That's not wrong, but it's incomplete. Because something else was already happening beneath that ideological surface, something that would define every crisis, every military buildup, every moment of brinkmanship for the next 44 years. Wait, this part is important. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something crucial. The United States and the Soviet Union didn't simply disagree about who should control Eastern Europe. What actually happened was far more fundamental. Each side became convinced that the other side had proven itself to be an existential threat, not because of their stated values, but because of what each believed the other side would do if given the power to act on those values. That distinction matters enormously. Consider Harry Truman's perspective in 1946. He had inherited a presidency facing an adversary that had just destroyed 40% of German industrial capacity with Soviet casualties. Stalin had fought the Nazis on the bloodiest front imaginable. From the Soviet perspective, they had done the hard work. They had sacrificed 27 million lives to defeat German fascism. And now, at the moment of victory, they watched the only other superpower possess an atomic bomb that the Soviets did not yet have. Stalin had been locked outside the atomic secret during the entire war. That was a calculated humiliation. Truman, on his end, believed, or was counseled to believe, that Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe suggested communist expansion was inevitable, and that only American strength could contain it. Neither man was reading the other's actual intentions. Each was reading the other's capabilities and extrapolating the worst. That is the precise moment the Cold War became not a disagreement, but a self-fulfilling prophecy. By 1947, the doctrine of containment had become official American policy. The Truman Doctrine declared that the United States would support any nation resisting Soviet expansion. But here's the part most histories gloss over. The United States didn't actually have the military capacity to back up that promise. The American military had demobilized rapidly after 1945. The armed forces had shrunk from 12 million soldiers to 1.5 million. The budget cuts had been severe. And yet Truman was committing America to a global conflict that didn't exist yet. He was betting the entire future of American foreign policy on an adversary that hadn't yet attacked. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was consolidating control over Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany with brutal efficiency. But they were doing it not because they had a master plan for world communism, at least, not primarily. They were doing it because they wanted a buffer zone. They had been invaded twice in 30 years, first by the Germans in 1941, then by the Western powers and their allies during the Russian Civil War. Twice, they had nearly been destroyed. A Soviet leader who didn't establish control over Eastern Europe would be vulnerable to his own political rivals at home. So both powers were acting logically from their own security perspectives, but neither power could see that the other was also acting from fear rather than ambition. And the tragedy of the Cold War, the part that shaped everything that came after, is that this misunderstanding was never corrected. It metastasized. It created patterns of behavior that became self-reinforcing. One side would see a move as aggressive, the other saw it as defensive. Every defensive move was interpreted as proof of expansionist intent. The Korean War, which began in June 1950, was the first moment this pattern of mutual misinterpretation produced actual bloodshed on a large scale. For Americans, the invasion of South Korea by the Communist North was seen as proof that communist expansion knew no limits. Stalin, they believed, was testing American resolve. If the United States didn't respond, Korea would fall, then Japan, then all of Asia. The domino theory it was called. And it seemed logical. But the Korean War had a completely different origin. North Korea's Kim Il-sung had actually requested permission from Stalin to invade the South. Stalin, initially hesitant, had eventually given his assent, but carefully. He told Kim that the United States probably wouldn't intervene militarily. He was being cautious. He didn't want direct confrontation with America. He had just acquired the atomic bomb 2 months earlier, in August 1949. That bomb was his security blanket, his proof that he had finally achieved parity with the West. He didn't want to risk it. When Truman made the decision to intervene in Korea with American combat troops, Stalin was shocked. He hadn't expected it. He believed his own intelligence reports that America lacked the will to fight another land war in Asia so soon after World War II. The invasion of South Korea was meant to be a quick success, a regional fait accompli. Instead, it triggered a complete transformation of American military strategy, and that transformation would define the Cold War for the next decade. The American military-industrial complex, which had barely begun to form in 1945, suddenly had its raison d'etre. Defense spending, which had been modest and politically contentious, became acceptable as an instrument of national security. The defense budget quadrupled between 1950 and 1955. Eisenhower, who would later warn against the very thing that was being built, became Supreme Commander of NATO and presided over the militarization of American foreign policy. The Korean War created the template for how the United States would respond to any communist movement anywhere on the planet. And here's what's crucial to understand. None of this was inevitable. The escalation spiral could have been interrupted at any of a dozen different points. Truman could have responded to Soviet consolidation in Eastern Europe with diplomacy instead of military threats. Stalin could have responded to American military buildup with restraint instead of accelerating Soviet rearmament. But neither leader had the political space at home to pursue restraint. Truman faced a Republican Congress that believed he had been soft on communism. Stalin faced hardliners in the Politburo who would have removed him if he had shown weakness. This brings us to the period from 1950 to 1962, the first peak of Cold War tension. During these years, the two superpowers built the stockpiles of nuclear weapons that would eventually make mutual annihilation a mathematical certainty. The Soviet Union tested its first thermonuclear bomb in 1953, shattering the American monopoly. By 1960, the United States had over 20,000 nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union had 7.00. Both sides were developing delivery systems, intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach from Moscow to New York or from Washington to Siberia. The doctrine of nuclear deterrence, mutual assured destruction, or MAD, as it became darkly known, was based on a simple but terrible logic. If both sides had enough weapons to destroy each other completely, neither side would ever use them, because the cost would be civilizational suicide. In theory, this created a kind of stability. In practice, it meant that both superpowers were betting the lives of millions of people on the rationality and restraint of the other side's leadership, and throughout the 1950s, restraint was not always in abundant supply. The U-2 incident of 1960 nearly shattered whatever fragile trust might still have existed. An American spy plane piloted by Gary Powers was shot down over Soviet territory on May Day, the most important Soviet holiday. The American government, caught in an outright lie, had to admit it had been conducting aerial surveillance of Soviet territory. Eisenhower, who had been working quietly toward a summit meeting with Khrushchev to reduce tensions, suddenly had no political space to pursue it. The incident poisoned relations and accelerated the arms race even further. But here is the part that most histories miss entirely, and it is the foundation for everything that comes after. By 1960, both superpowers had begun to realize, on some level, that the nuclear arms race had become economically unsustainable. The Soviet economy was growing much slower than the American economy, but the Soviets were spending roughly double the percentage of their GDP on defense. This was not a sustainable path. The Soviet system simply did not produce consumer goods efficiently enough to wage a prolonged military competition with the West. This economic reality would eventually become the fatal flaw that brought down the entire Soviet system, but in 1960 it was not yet visible to most observers. What was visible was a Soviet Union that seemed dynamic and threatening. Khrushchev had launched Sputnik in 1957, terrifying Americans who suddenly believed the Soviets were ahead in the space race. He was making bold statements about burying the West. He was endorsing wars of national liberation in the Third World. To American observers, the Soviet threat seemed to be growing. In reality, Khrushchev was in a weakening position. He had alienated the Soviet military establishment by promising to reduce the size of conventional forces. He had disappointed hardliners in the party by his rhetoric about peaceful coexistence with the West. And he had badly misjudged American intentions, believing that the new American president, John F. Kennedy, would be weak and malleable. Instead, Kennedy would prove to be something far more dangerous, an ideological true believer who saw the Cold War as a moral struggle between freedom and tyranny. When Kennedy took office in January 1961, he carried with him a conviction that the Eisenhower administration had been complacent about the Soviet threat. The Eisenhower administration had actually been trying to avoid war. Kennedy believed that America needed to demonstrate resolve, to show the Soviet Union that the United States would not back down. His first 100 days would include two foreign policy disasters that would shape everything that came next. The first disaster was the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. The second was the Berlin Crisis, which began in August 1961 and led directly to the construction of the Berlin Wall. Both of these events were consequences of the same fundamental misunderstanding that had driven the Cold War since its inception. Each side believed it was responding to the other side's aggression, when in fact both sides were responding to their own insecurities. The Bay of Pigs invasion was planned before Kennedy took office, but he authorized it without adequate preparation or backup planning. The invasion attempted to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government in Cuba using CIA-trained Cuban exiles. The operation failed catastrophically. The exiles were captured or killed. The Soviet Union, observing this American aggression 90 miles from their hemisphere, concluded that Kennedy was reckless and dangerous. That conclusion would have enormous consequences. The Berlin Crisis followed almost immediately. The Berlin Wall was not built by the Soviet Union to threaten the West. It was built as an admission of failure. Millions of East Germans had escaped to the West through Berlin since the Soviet blockade had been lifted in 1949. The Eastern German economy was collapsing as educated workers, skilled professionals, and ambitious young people fled to the wealthier West. By 1960, the exodus had become a hemorrhage. If it continued, East Germany would be emptied of human capital entirely. Walter Ulbricht, the East German leader, requested Soviet permission to seal the border. Khrushchev, reluctantly, granted it. On August 13, 1961, construction of the Berlin Wall began. For Westerners, the wall was a symbol of Soviet oppression, and it was that. But it was also a symbol of Soviet weakness. The Soviets were forced to wall in their own people to prevent them from escaping. This was the opposite of the triumphalist image the Soviet Union was trying to project. Kennedy, newly embarrassed by the Bay of Pigs failure, saw the wall as a Soviet aggression that demanded an American response. He didn't understand that he was actually witnessing Soviet desperation, not Soviet strength. Instead of recognizing this as a sign that the Soviet system was unsustainable, he interpreted it as evidence that Khrushchev was testing American resolve. Kennedy sent additional American military units to Berlin and gave a speech famous for the phrase, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I am a Berliner. The statement was meant to show solidarity with West Berliners, and it did. But it also escalated tensions further. It convinced Khrushchev that Kennedy was not going to back down, and that some kind of decisive action would be necessary to restore Soviet credibility. Khrushchev, facing pressure from military hardliners and from the Chinese communists who were attacking him for weakness, was trapped in a corner. He needed to demonstrate that he could stand up to Kennedy. This was the state of affairs when a Cuban leader, only 90 miles from the American coast, approached the Soviet Union with a proposal that would bring the world closest it had ever come to nuclear war. That is where we must continue in the next chapter of this narrative, because the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of everything we have discussed so far: the mutual misunderstandings, the escalation spirals, the political pressures that drove both leaders toward confrontation instead of restraint. And in that crisis, the world learned that the logic of mutual assured destruction had a fundamental flaw that no theorist had fully anticipated. But I'm getting ahead of the story. Let me back up and explain how we arrived at this point, because understanding the Cuban Missile Crisis requires understanding something crucial about the nature of the Cold War itself, something that the official narratives often obscure. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not emerge from a vacuum. It was the culmination of years of American foreign policy decisions that had systematically pushed the Soviet Union into a corner, and a new president who believed he could reshape the global balance of power through confrontation rather than negotiation. When Kennedy took office in January 1961, he inherited a plan from the Eisenhower administration to overthrow the Cuban government of Fidel Castro. The plan was called Operation Zapata, and it was premised on the belief that Cuban exiles, once landed on the island, would spark a popular uprising that would bring down Castro's regime. Kennedy approved it, but the plan had been built on faulty assumptions and poor intelligence. The Cuban people did not rise up. The exiles were quickly surrounded and captured. The invasion lasted 3 days. The failure was public and humiliating. Kennedy, who had promised vigor and decisive action, had delivered a military disaster. The political cost was severe, but the strategic cost was even greater. Castro, who had been consolidating power in Cuba since 1959, now had proof that the United States would use force to remove him, and he had a powerful ally ready to back him: the Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity. The Americans had shown weakness and recklessness in equal measure. They had tried to invade Cuba, failed, and exposed their willingness to conduct covert military operations against a sovereign nation. Castro was now firmly in the Soviet orbit, and Khrushchev began to treat Cuba not as a distant revolutionary ally, but as a strategic asset, a foothold in the American hemisphere. But Khrushchev faced a problem. The Soviet Union, despite its apparent strength, was actually in a position of strategic inferiority. The United States had roughly 4 times as many nuclear warheads as the Soviet Union. The Americans had deployed bombers and missiles in Turkey, Italy, and Britain, all pointing at Soviet territory. The Soviets had one advantage: the missiles based in the Soviet Union itself. But even those were increasingly vulnerable to American first-strike capability. The strategic calculation was grim. If war came, American missiles would likely destroy Soviet missiles before they could be launched. The Soviets would lose. Khrushchev needed to change the equation, and he believed that placing Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the American coast, would restore balance. It would be his answer to American missiles in Turkey. Wait. This is the moment where context becomes critical to understanding why the crisis happened at all. Before we continue, I need to emphasize something that most Cold War histories gloss over. The decisions that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis were not made by irrational men or by accident. They were made by leaders operating within specific strategic frameworks, responding to very real military and political pressures. If you want to understand the mechanisms driving Cold War escalation, the logic of nuclear deterrence, the psychology of prestige and credibility, the way miscalculation compounds, those patterns are explained in depth in our complete Cold War guide. You'll find it in the description and pinned comment. That ebook walks through exactly how each leader's calculations shaped the trajectory toward October 1962. So Khrushchev made his decision. Beginning in the summer of 1962, Soviet ships began carrying intermediate-range ballistic missiles toward Cuba. The missiles were packed in crates, disguised as agricultural equipment or generic cargo. Soviet troops followed, around 42,000 men, technicians, and support personnel. The operation was called Operation Anadyr, and it was conducted with strict secrecy. Soviet officials lied about it in diplomatic channels. Khrushchev himself lied about it, assuring the American ambassador that no offensive weapons would be placed in Cuba. But American intelligence was watching. The U-2 spy plane program, directed by the CIA and the Air Force, had been conducting regular photographic reconnaissance flights over Cuba since early 1962. The cameras on these aircraft could resolve objects as small as 3 feet across from an altitude of 70,000 feet. By early October, the evidence was unmistakable. The Soviets had deployed missiles to Cuba. Kennedy was briefed on the morning of October 16th. The photographs were presented to him in the Oval Office. The images showed without question that Soviet intermediate-range ballistic missiles, capable of carrying nuclear warheads, had been positioned in Cuba. Some of these missiles were already operational. Others were still being assembled. All of them could reach the continental United States within 15 minutes of launch. The political crisis came immediately. Kennedy had campaigned on a strong anti-communist platform. He had just suffered the humiliation of the Bay of Pigs. And now, with the 1962 midterm elections only 3 weeks away, his administration faced the possibility that Soviet nuclear missiles were being positioned in the Western Hemisphere, a direct challenge to American supremacy in what had been considered an exclusive sphere of influence. Kennedy established what became known as the Executive Committee, or ExComm. It included his cabinet secretaries, military advisors, the director of the CIA, and other senior officials. For 13 days, this group met in secret to debate options. The military brass pushed for an immediate airstrike to destroy the missiles before they could be launched. Some civilian advisors agreed. Others urged restraint. Kennedy himself was caught between the political pressure to act decisively and the fear that military action could spark a nuclear war. The central debate was brutal in its simplicity. If you strike first, you kill Soviet soldiers and destroy Soviet missiles on Cuban soil. That risks Soviet retaliation, perhaps against West Berlin, perhaps against Turkey, perhaps against American allies elsewhere. And if the Soviets retaliate with nuclear weapons, you have just started a nuclear war. But if you do nothing, you leave Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida, and you appear weak to your political opponents and to allies around the world. It was Adlai Stevenson, the UN ambassador, who first articulated an alternative. He proposed a naval blockade, what the administration would later call a quarantine, to distinguish it from the more aggressive term, combined with diplomatic pressure. The blockade would prevent Soviet ships from delivering additional missiles to Cuba. Diplomatic channels would be open to negotiate the removal of the missiles already there. Military force would remain an option, but it would not be the first move. Kennedy agreed. On October 22nd, he addressed the American people on television. His speech was carefully calibrated, firm enough to satisfy hawks who wanted aggressive action, diplomatic enough to leave room for negotiations, and terrifying enough to prepare the nation for the possibility of nuclear war. He announced the blockade. He demanded the removal of the missiles, and he warned that any missile launched from Cuba would trigger a full retaliatory response against the Soviet Union. The world held its breath. Soviet ships carrying cargo headed toward Cuba continued on their course. American naval vessels took up positions to intercept them. The first confrontation would occur within hours. For the first time in the Cold War, two nuclear superpowers were on a direct collision course, and no one knew if either leader would back down. Khrushchev's response came in messages to Kennedy, long, emotional letters that oscillated between threats and pleas. In one moment, Khrushchev insisted that the missiles would remain, that any attempt to remove them would be met with force, that war would be the result. In the next moment, he suggested that perhaps both superpowers could step back, that perhaps a deal was possible. The messages were analyzed obsessively by American intelligence officials searching for any indication of Soviet intent. The critical moment came on October 27, what became known as Black Saturday. An American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson, was killed. It was the first combat death of the crisis. The Pentagon demanded retaliation. The military chiefs of staff urged Kennedy to order airstrikes immediately. The political pressure was intense. An American had been killed by Soviet weapons. The American public expected a response. But Kennedy held firm. He refused to authorize immediate retaliation. Instead, he sent his brother Robert, the Attorney General, to meet secretly with the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrinin. The meeting was conducted in back channels, away from the public eye, away from the media. Kennedy's message was both a threat and an offer. If the Soviets do not remove the missiles from Cuba within a specific time frame, the United States will remove them by force. But if the Soviets agree to remove the missiles, the crisis can be resolved without war. There was also a hidden element to Kennedy's offer. Through back channels, the administration had already agreed that if the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba, the United States would remove its missiles from Turkey, a concession that Kennedy kept secret from the Turkish government and from many members of his own cabinet. The trade would be equal in military terms, but unequal in political optics. Publicly, it would appear that Kennedy had simply stood firm and Khrushchev had backed down. The American missiles in Turkey would be dismantled quietly, months later, without drawing attention. On October 28, Khrushchev sent a public message announcing that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba. The crisis was over. The world had stepped back from the edge. But the resolution was far more fragile and contingent than it appeared to the public. Kennedy had authorized contingency plans for airstrikes and invasion. Khrushchev had given his commanders in Cuba authorization to use tactical nuclear weapons if an American invasion began. Both sides had gone much further toward actual war than the American public ever knew. The Cuban Missile Crisis appeared to be a decisive American victory. Kennedy had faced down Khrushchev. The Soviet missiles were removed. American power had prevailed. But this interpretation missed something crucial about what had actually transpired. The crisis revealed that mutual assured destruction was not a stable equilibrium. It was a precarious balance, constantly threatened by miscalculation, domestic political pressure, military pressures, and the exponential growth of nuclear arsenals on both sides. The crisis also revealed something about the nature of leadership in the nuclear age. Kennedy had inherited a set of strategic assumptions from his predecessors, that the United States had clear nuclear superiority, that this superiority could be translated into political advantage, that the Soviets would not seriously challenge American interests in the Western Hemisphere. Khrushchev, facing Soviet inferiority, had tried to change the equation through a dramatic, audacious move. Both men had been forced by the logic of nuclear deterrence to contemplate the unthinkable, and both had, ultimately, chosen restraint. But restraint was not the same as resolution. The underlying tensions remained. The Cold War was not ending. It was entering a new phase, one in which both superpowers were beginning to realize that victory in nuclear war was impossible, and that the only path forward was to manage the competition in ways that avoided nuclear catastrophe. What happened next would take another quarter-century to unfold. The Cuban Missile Crisis had taught both Washington and Moscow a bitter lesson. The world could not survive many more moments like that. The nuclear arsenals on both sides continued to grow. By 1970, the Soviet Union had achieved rough parity with the United States. They could destroy each other many times over, and that parity, paradoxically, created a strange new kind of stability. It was called mutually assured destruction. Both sides possessed enough weapons to annihilate human civilization. Neither side could attack without being destroyed in return. Therefore, neither side would attack. The logic was airtight and terrifying, but it worked. The years between 1965 and 1972 saw the Vietnam War consume American attention and resources. That conflict would kill 58,000 American soldiers and over 2 million Vietnamese. It would tear American society apart, spark the largest anti-war movement in the nation's history, and ultimately end in American withdrawal and North Vietnamese victory. But Vietnam was not a direct confrontation between the superpowers. It was a proxy war, and it followed the rules of the nuclear age. Neither side could win decisively, and neither side could risk direct engagement. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was facing its own crisis. By 1968, the communist bloc was fragmenting. Czechoslovakia, under Alexander Dubček, attempted to reform communism into something more humane, what they called socialism with a human face. Moscow watched with growing alarm, and in August 1968, Soviet tanks rolled into Prague. The Czechoslovak Spring was crushed. Thousands were killed. The message was clear. The Soviet Union would not tolerate deviation from its vision of the communist world. But this act of repression had a consequence that Moscow had not foreseen. It deepened the split between the Soviet Union and China. Both claimed to be communist. Both claimed legitimacy as leaders of the communist world. But by the late 1960s, they were locked in a rivalry that was nearly as intense as the Cold War itself. Border skirmishes between Soviet and Chinese forces grew more frequent and more violent. By 1969, They were engaged in open conflict along the Ussuri River. This was the opening that American President Richard Nixon would exploit. In 1972, after months of secret diplomatic negotiations, Nixon visited China. It was a stunning reversal of American policy. For 2 decades, the United States had refused to recognize the People's Republic of China, treating it as a pariah state. Now, the American president himself was in Beijing, shaking hands with Mao Zedong. The Cold War was no longer a simple two-player game. Wait, this development is crucial to understanding what comes next. The opening to China fundamentally altered the Cold War's geometry. By playing Beijing against Moscow, Nixon achieved something remarkable. He weakened the Soviet Union without firing a shot. Moscow now faced the prospect of a Chinese-American alignment against Soviet interests. It was strategic brilliance, and it would shape the next phase of the Cold War. The early 1970s also saw the first serious arms control agreements between the United States and Soviet Union. In 1972, both superpowers signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, known as SALT I. It was an acknowledgement that nuclear escalation was spiraling out of control. SALT I did not reduce nuclear weapons, it merely limited their growth, but it represented a fundamental shift in Cold War logic. For the first time, both sides formally agreed to constrain their military expansion. This period became known as détente, a French word meaning relaxation of tension. From roughly 1972 to 1979, the Cold War entered a more measured phase. Trade between the superpowers increased, cultural exchanges resumed. The threat of nuclear war seemed, for a moment, to recede. Americans and Soviets even conducted a joint space mission in 1975, with American and Soviet astronauts docking in orbit and shaking hands in weightlessness. The symbolism was unmistakable. The two superpowers could cooperate even as they competed. But détente was fragile. It was based on a dangerous illusion that the Cold War could be managed, that both sides could compete for influence around the world without provoking the other. That illusion shattered in December 1979, when Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan. The Soviets claimed they were responding to a request from the Afghan government to help suppress Islamic insurgents. In reality, they were attempting to establish a client state on their southern border, to expand Soviet influence toward the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. The Afghan invasion was a turning point. It shattered détente. American President Jimmy Carter denounced the invasion and enacted a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. He ordered a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. More significantly, he increased military spending and approved the supply of advanced weapons to the Afghan Mujahideen fighters who were resisting Soviet occupation. The United States, which had once supported the Shah of Iran and various anti-communist dictators, now found itself allied with Islamic insurgents. The Cold War was entering its final, most volatile phase. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States. Reagan had been a fierce anti-communist throughout his political career. He viewed the Soviet Union not as a competitor to be managed through détente, but as an enemy to be defeated. His presidency marked a dramatic shift in American Cold War strategy. Reagan massively increased military spending. He deployed intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Western Europe, directly targeted at Soviet territory. He spoke openly of the Soviet Union as an evil empire. Hold on. Before we move deeper into the final chapter, I want to bring you back to something essential. The patterns you are seeing now, the escalation, the reversal from détente to confrontation, the weaponization of regional conflicts, these are not random fluctuations. They are the product of specific strategic doctrines, alliance structures, and ideological commitments on both sides. To truly understand how the Cold War ended, you need to grasp these mechanisms. That is why I encourage you to get your hands on our complete guide in the description and in the pinned comment. It walks you through the strategic logic, the declassified decision-making, and the cascading consequences that led to the final chapter of this era. It is essential reading for anyone who lived through these years and wants to understand them with real clarity and depth. Reagan's military buildup was extraordinary. In the early 1980s, American defense spending increased from roughly $130 billion per year to over $300 billion by 1985. New weapon systems were developed: the stealth bomber, the B-1 bomber, the Trident missile submarine. Reagan also pushed forward with an audacious, controversial program called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, a plan to build a space-based system that could shoot down Soviet nuclear missiles. To the Soviets, SDI appeared to threaten the very foundation of nuclear deterrence. If America could defend itself against Soviet missiles, then mutually assured destruction would no longer apply. Soviet leaders saw SDI as the ultimate provocation. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was in crisis. The economy was stagnating. The war in Afghanistan was proving unwinnable. The Mujahideen, armed with American weapons, were inflicting heavy casualties on Soviet forces. The Soviet leadership was aging and divided. In 1982, Leonid Brezhnev died. His successors were temporary caretakers. But in 1985, a new general secretary took power, Mikhail Gorbachev. At 54 years old, he was the youngest Soviet leader in decades, and he understood something that his predecessors had not. The Soviet system was dying. Gorbachev introduced two revolutionary concepts to Soviet politics: glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. Glasnost permitted Soviet citizens to speak more freely and allowed criticism of the communist system to be published. Perestroika was supposed to reform the Soviet economy and make it more efficient. But these policies had an unintended consequence. They unleashed forces that the Communist Party could not control. In 1986, a nuclear reactor exploded at Chernobyl in Soviet Ukraine. The accident killed dozens immediately and exposed hundreds of thousands to dangerous radiation. But more importantly, it revealed the incompetence and dishonesty of the Soviet system. The government had initially tried to cover up the disaster. The reactor was of a dangerous design that would never have been permitted in the West. Soviet citizens watched as their government lied to them about the danger. It was a catastrophic loss of faith in communist authority. At the same time, Gorbachev was reaching out to the United States. He understood that the arms race was crippling the Soviet economy. He could not simultaneously modernize the Soviet system and compete militarily with the United States at Reagan's spending levels. In 1985, Gorbachev and Reagan met in Geneva for the first Soviet-American summit in 6 years. By 1986, they met again in Reykjavik, Iceland. These talks did not immediately produce breakthroughs, but they established a new atmosphere. Two leaders who had begun their terms as implacable ideological enemies were beginning to build trust. Then, in 1987, Gorbachev made a decisive move. He proposed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty. This treaty would eliminate an entire category of nuclear weapons, those with ranges between 500 and 5.500 kilometers. It was the first arms control agreement that actually reduced nuclear arsenals, rather than merely limiting their growth. Reagan, who had spent his career warning about the Soviet menace, agreed. In December 1987, the two leaders signed the INF Treaty in Washington. It was a stunning symbolic moment. The two superpowers had agreed to reduce, not expand, their nuclear forces. The winds of change were now blowing through the Soviet system with increasing force. In 1989, as Gorbachev's reforms continued to destabilize the communist order, the peoples of Eastern Europe rose up. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, which had been suppressed since 1981, re-emerged and forced free elections. In Hungary, the government began allowing people to leave for the West. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall itself came down. Thousands of Berliners, east and west, gathered at the wall with hammers and pickaxes, smashing through the concrete barrier that had divided their city for 28 years. The symbolic power of that moment cannot be overstated. The wall had stood for 28 years. It had killed over 140 people who died trying to escape from East Berlin to the West. It had represented, in concrete form, the division of Europe and the division of the world. Its fall signaled that the Cold War itself was ending. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union would dissolve entirely. The Communist Party would be disbanded. The Russian Republic, under Boris Yeltsin, would replace the Soviet Union as the sovereign state. The nuclear standoff that had terrified the world for 45 years would be superseded by new challenges and new threats. But here is the revelation I promised you at the beginning of this video. The Cold War did not end because one side defeated the other in battle. It did not end because democracy triumphed over communism in a clear ideological victory. It ended because the Soviet system could not sustain itself. The arms race had bankrupted the Soviet economy. The Afghan War had proven that military power alone could not maintain an empire. Glasnost and perestroika had unleashed centrifugal forces that the Communist Party could not contain. The system collapsed under its own weight, not because it was conquered from without, but because it could not reform from within. The irony is profound. Ronald Reagan spent trillions of dollars on weapons and military buildup in the belief that American military strength would force Soviet collapse. And there is evidence that American pressure did contribute to Soviet decision-making, but the ultimate cause of Soviet dissolution was internal. The system's fundamental inability to compete economically with the West while maintaining ideological control over 15 republics and numerous satellite states. Gorbachev's attempt to reform the system without abandoning communist rule proved impossible. You could not have glasnost and totalitarianism. You could not have perestroika and central planning. The contradictions were irresolvable. What you are holding in your mind now is the essential structure of Cold War history. It began with the collision between American capitalism and Soviet communism in 1945. It was driven forward by proxy wars, nuclear terror, ideological competition, and alliance building. It was sustained by leaders on both sides who believed they were fighting for the future of humanity. And it ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, the quiet dissolution of a system that could not adapt to the modern world. This is the pattern you must apply going forward. When a system becomes unable to reform itself while maintaining its core identity, collapse becomes inevitable. The Soviet Union tried to change without surrendering power. It tried to open society without abandoning control. The contradiction was fatal. So consider this in your own time. What systems in your world are facing similar contradictions? What structures are trying to adapt without transforming? What power centers are resisting the very changes necessary to preserve them? The Cold War teaches us that rigidity in the face of change is not strength, it is a path to irrelevance and dissolution. The Cold War lasted 45 years. It shaped the geopolitics of the entire second half of the 20th century. It claimed tens of millions of lives in proxy wars. It brought humanity to the brink of nuclear annihilation on multiple occasions. It divided the world into competing blocs and ideological camps, and in the end, it resolved not through victory or defeat, but through the internal exhaustion of one of its two antagonists. That is the story we have traced together, from the ruins of 1945 to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, from the first tensions in Europe to the crisis in Cuba, from the war in Vietnam to the final years of détente and transformation. Now, as you move forward with this knowledge, ask yourself, what patterns from the Cold War era are you still seeing in your world today? What new rivalries are forming along similar lines? What nuclear powers are competing for influence? How are authoritarian systems responding to pressures for change? The Cold War may have ended, but its lessons remain vital. The world that emerged from its ashes still grapples with the consequences of those 45 years. Thank you for watching Cold War Clarity. If this video brought the Cold War into focus for you, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. I'd genuinely love to hear in the comments which decade of the Cold War changed your understanding the most. And if you want the full, detailed framework of Cold War strategy and decision-making, the link is in the description. Until next time, stay curious about the history that made us.